Told. That's what I'm being told.
Yeah. You're sitting down? Nice to see you. A rare opportunity, unfortunately.
Yishar Koach to everyone. I apologize for my abrupt and late arrival, but I appreciate the warm welcome. To share some thoughts quickly that have been percolating in my mind recently. The Midrash Rabbah in Parshat B'Shalach. We're now approaching the 7th day of Pesach, which Klal Yisrael celebrates the nace of the Kriyat Yam Suf, the miracle of the splitting of the sea. The Midrash Rabbah says something very profound, that Moshe Rabbeinu begins the song of the sea with the word Az Yashir. With already at the Pshat level, the Mefarshim are grappling with the use of this word because it seems to be a word that is in the future tense. But be that as it may, this word Az, the Midrash hones in on this word and says something very, very interesting. It says, Bo'u re'ei darkam shel tzadikim, come and see the ways of the righteous. Shebedarkam she'im chotim, kach heim metaknim. That in the same manner in which the righteous sin, they use that very attribute to correct the damage which they brought about. It's already notable to say that tzadikim sin. It's saying that's a given, that the righteous sin. But what makes the righteous unique is that the attribute that they use to sin is the attribute that they use to correct. Hu chata be'oz, Moshe Rabbeinu sinned with the word oz. V'hu tikein be'oz, and then he corrected his sin with the word oz. What is that referring to? When did Moshe Rabbeinu, is it possible to say such a thing? When did Moshe Rabbeinu sin with the word oz? When did he sin with the word oz? So Moshe Rabbeinu sinned with the word Oz all the way back in the beginning of the story, where God finally convinces him, he argues him down to go to Paro, even though he's very reluctant, and he shows up and he gives him the message, Shlach et ami v'yavduni bamidbar, send away my people and they will serve me in the desert. And not only does Paro refuse to send them, but he makes things worse. He says, not only am I not going to let them go, but clearly they have way too much time on their hands that they're able to think about freedom and serving God in the desert. Clearly they're not working hard enough, and I'm going to double the load of work that they need to do, and then they won't have time to think about redemption and serving God and all this nonsense. So Moshe turns to God in that moment and says to him, Ume'oz bati el paro her'a la'am hazeh v'hatzeh lo hitzalta et amecha. From the moment that I've arrived in Egypt, things have gotten worse for this nation. Me'oz bati el paro her'a la'am hazeh, and you have not saved the people. On that pasuk, the Midrash Rabbah in Parshat Shemot, several parshiot early, says an unbelievable, profound thing, astounding thing. Amar Rabbi Ishmael, Hatzel lo hitzalta vadai. Moshe was turning to God in that moment and says, you will never save them. If things aren't moving, not only are things not moving forward, but things are moving backward. This is clearly an indication that not only will you not save them now, but you will never save them. Umikan kibel Moshe tadin shelo yikanes la'aretz, says the Midrash. That's the final Midrash Rabbah on Parshat Shemot. That at that moment Moshe Rabbeinu received the judgment that he would not go into the land. How does the Midrash know that? Because the pasuk says, in God's response, Ata tireh et asher e'aseh leParo. You will see now what I will do to Paro. Says the Midrash, Bil milchamot Paro ata tireh. You will see the wars that I will wage against Paro. Aval bil milchamot shelamed aleph melachim. But the wars that I will wage against the 31 kings, Yoshua talmidecha, Yoshua your disciple, he will see those wars. Usually we equate the sin of Moshe Rabbeinu to the sin of the rock, much later on in the story. But it was at this moment that Moshe Rabbeinu, there was already a potential issue with Moshe Rabbeinu's leadership. Moshe sinned with the word Oz, and he also corrected with the word Oz. What does that mean, to sin with the word Oz? What does that mean? There was a Chacham in Turkey about 300 years ago, Shmuel Ashkenazi, who wrote a very important Perush on the Midrash Rabbah called Yefei Toar. Typically they print the abridged version in the standard Vilna Midrashim, but it's a very, very large work. And he says what I feel is the definitive explanation of this Midrash. that the chait of the word Oz is lachto neged Hashem b'nekudat hazman, is to sin against God in the infinitesimal moment. Meaning, Moshe Rabbeinu grasped that moment in time and what was taking place in that moment, and that was the sum total of reality right there. That's it. If things aren't getting better now, that means things are never getting better. That's what that means. If things are not progressing in this moment, that means that things will never progress. That's what it means to sin with the word Oz. That's the delicate connotation of this word Oz. Oz is referring to a singular moment on a timeline, either in the past or in the future, but it's referring to a specific moment on the timeline. This is the sin with the word Oz, to grasp all of reality through the framework of this one moment in time. How does one correct with the word Oz? What is the tikkun that someone can do with the word Oz? So in order to answer this question, I think we need to take a look about the content of Shirat Hayam. If one person asks, what is the content of Shirat Hayam? So one might say it's the Jewish people praising God for saving them from the Egyptians. It seems to be what so you would be half right if you said that. It starts off praising God for the salvation from the Egyptians. But then it goes into this rather lengthy and poetic description of things that are meant to take place many, many years in the future. About Moab and the Pelishtim, that God's going to bring the people to Israel. Right? Mikdash Hashem konenu yadecha, there's going to be a Beit HaMikdash. That's not going to happen for another 400 years, that there's going to be a Beit HaMikdash. It's the Az Yashir, beyond just being this organic welling up from within of praising God for a salvation. It was the Jewish people being able to see the grand timeline of Jewish history. The grand timeline of Jewish history. To correct, to elevate, to bring a tikkun with the word Oz means that you see the point in time that you're at now, not as the sum total of reality, but on the contrary, as one point in a very large timeline. That's what it means to be metaken with the word Oz. A person who, an individual and a collective, the individual and Am Yisrael as a whole, that act from a place of faith, that act from a place of true and authentic commitment to Avodat Hashem, the reward for that is being able to experience oneself in a point on a very, very grand narrative arc. If you really do the work, if you're really willing to give it your all, so to speak, then you no longer perceive yourself as this small, infinitesimal point on the timeline, but rather part of a grand timeline. You see that. The other time that we see this, of course, is in the Tefillah of Chana. The Tefillah of Chana, who, as we know, the mother of Shmuel HaNavi, who waits many, many years for a child, and eventually is granted a child, and not just any child, but a child that will bring about the Malchut in the Jewish people. And in Perek Bet of Sefer Shmuel, she gives over this very, very powerful poetic song, praising God. And the praises there seem rather generic. Keshet Giburim Chatat, Hashem Emitu Mechayeh, God, he raises from the dead, he crushes the strong and elevates the weak. They seem rather generic. But if one looks in the Targum Uziel, I wouldn't say the translation, but rather the commentary, the archetypical commentary that was written by Yonatan ben Uziel, a disciple of Hillel HaZaken, to interpret the symbolism of the prophets, what Chana is referring to in each one of these verses is one of the grand milestones of Jewish history. Right? Keshet Kiburim Chatat is referring to, if I'm not mistaken, it's referring to the Chashmonaim, the time of the Second Temple. Right? Hashem Emitu Mechayeh is referring to later salvations in the Jewish history, whether it's the salvation from the Persians or the salvation from the Roman Empire. She's referring to milestones way, way in the future, over 1,000 years in the future. And because this is the reward of someone who places themselves, their own personal, individual consciousness, they place themselves in the context of the Jewish people as a whole. They merit to see that. They merit to see that their point on the timeline is just that. It's a point on a grand timeline. Unfortunately, to our chagrin, there are many, many people who see Jewish history starting at a certain place and ending at a certain place. They have a very, very narrow view of Jewish history. Some hold that Jewish history started in 1948, and will end when we manage to make peace with our cousins. That's the span of Jewish history. It starts in 1948, and we're trying to get to Oslo 2.0. That's Jewish history. They have a plan, right? It started at a certain time, and that's Mashiach Kavayachol. The Mashiach is when we get to that place, right? But us who have merited to be the disciples of Moshe Rabbeinu, alav shalom, we understand that Jewish history has a very, very clear starting point. Right? Lech lecha me'artzecha el ha'aretz asher areka. That is the starting point of Jewish history. And the ending point of Jewish history is also very clear. Kohanim ba'avodatam u'levi'im b'shiram u'zimram. That is the end point of Jewish history. That is the goal. And someone who has that authentic commitment that the Jewish people embodied at Kriyat Yamsuf, vaya'aminu b'Hashem Moshe Avdo, to inculcate that primary, that basic, fundamental Jewish value of faithfulness to Hashem, at that moment we are able to perceive ourselves not as fragmented individuals, but as a point on a grand arc, on a grand narrative arc. And Be'ezrat Hashem, through the Avodah of the Regel, through us all getting together in this place of Simcha, and really communing with the spirit of the Chag, we should merit both individually and collectively to fully embody Vaya'aminu b'Hashem u'b'Moshe Avdo. Chizku v'ya'ametz levavechem kol ha'miyachalim l'Adonai.